So we're here today to reflect on the forest and fish after 20 years. For some, it's a celebration. For others, not so much. For those of you that are guests or speakers, I want to first share a little about WFFA. Our mission is to empower citizen ownership and stewardship of private forest land. Our slogan is a crop today, another tomorrow for good forest management. After 28 years, Bonnie and I had spent an awful lot of money and a lot of work, and we finally had our first real harvest last year. Not exactly a pot of gold, but maybe for our great-great-great-grandkids' education fund at some point in time. Our motto is Stewards of the Land for generations to come. Our hope today is to try to shed some light on how or whether we'll be able to reach this lofty goal. Jim Peters tells me that the tribes have similar goals that focus on 7 generations into the future. That's 2 or 3 crop rotations. I can see one more generation because our son Matt is in the audience here somewhere. He was supposed to be sitting over there, but I don't know where the hell he went. Oh, there he is. Okay. Just like all kids, don't mind, and grandkids are even worse. But I'm concerned that there are just too many disincentives or incentives for conversion and disincentives, financial and social, clouding the future. Hopefully a family member will actually someday harvest the trees that I planted this spring. Go there. WFFA goals are to provide educational programs, promote fair taxation and regulation, and increase public awareness of family-owned forests. Mainly, we are the voice of small family forest owners in Olympia. We're even a voice for the non-joiners who make up the vast majority of small forest landowners. I think Elaine calls them free riders. We'll hear more about why forest and fish came about in the history panel, but from a small forest landowner standpoint, this was a train coming that was going to run us over if we didn't get on board. This train almost tore our association apart. We lost about 1/3 of our membership. I have good friends that are still mad, mostly about losing their cherished property rights and some income. Some of who even refuse to attend today because it would just be too painful to relive. Several of our folks volunteered a lot of their time for several months in 1999, particularly Nels Hansen, Chan Norenberg, Sherry Fox, Maurice Williamson, along with Bob Playfair, Gene Bolton, Harold Brunstad, Martin Flynn. Some in the audience that helped, according to Gene Bolton, are Rick Dunning, Greg and Sue Patillo, Bill Stewart, Brian and Donna Laux, Dick Atkins, Tom Sun, Gene Anest, Faye Marie Beck, and Doug Stinson. I'm probably missing a lot of other volunteers that helped in that process. So in my opinion, despite its many problems, these folks negotiated a pretty fair deal for us. Although in hindsight, we were overly trusting and very naive about implementation. Those of us that supported forest and fish did so in support of very good stewardship, clean water, and salmon. Genuine desire to protect salmon. We were naive, as I said, about most of the additional details and overly complex processes. But in the end, forest and fish was a 4-legged stool, a stool that could not stand without each of the 4 goals: clean water, forest sector viability, endangered species assurances, and harvestable supplies of salmon. These 4 goals were purposely linked, equal, and balanced. If you also take a look at the sign to the right that Cindy Mitchell from WFPA gave to us to show today, it shows that we really did keep up our end of the bargain. Look at all the things that were accomplished under Forest and Fish for salmon recovery, habitat protection, and water quality. Fortunately for small forest landowners, there was a small business economic impact statement required prior to implementation of these new rules. They found that the regulations under Forest and Fish would disproportionately impact small forest landowners. Therefore, they required the creation of programs and policies that would mitigate for these impacts. The list includes the Forest Riparian Easement Program, the Family Forest Fish Passage Program, which actually came a little bit later, but was part of the original deal. Technical assistance by creating a new department within the Department of Natural Resources. Tammy Makita is the current administrator for that. It also included smaller buffers for the very small landowners that had 20-acre parcels or less. And ultimately, smaller buffers for our smaller, relatively low impact harvests. Implementation efforts towards achieving the promised mitigation has consumed many of us, as it required ever more volunteerism, participation on the Small Landowner Advisory Committee, TFW policy, SEMER, and annual legislative efforts to help DNR's funding requests, just to meet the requirements of Forest and Fish we thought the legislature had agreed to already. We essentially have to have a do-over every 2 years. All of this extra effort has pulled resources from other traditional WFFA goals. Despite these fair mitigations, Forest and Fish was and still is a huge lift for our small organization. So, how good are we doing on these required program mitigations? The Forest Riparian Easement Program, DNR asked for $17 million. The legislature was just able to fund $2.5 million, which leaves us $6 years in arrears and sliding backwards. The Family Forest Fish Passage Program, DNR asked for $20 million. The legislature was able to fund $5 million, which leaves about $110 million on the waiting list. And the smallest asked technical assistance to help Tammy keep some small landowner stewardship foresters in the office. The $1.6 million ask, and for reasons I don't understand, there was nothing funded, and I don't know what we're going to do there. So from our standpoint, the budget process seems to be a little bit broken. Natural resources just doesn't seem to get a lot of attention in a state that prides itself on being so environmentally conscious. So how do we collectively all make ourselves more visible? There's certainly a need for the coordination of all of the natural resource management agencies. Otherwise, rural Washington is going to continue losing out. In an ideal world, the natural resource agencies would not be competing with us for scarce funds, as we all have the same goals of keeping forest land forested, but for different reasons. We should be in a symbiotic relationship with the state agencies, and they should be with us, and especially with the environmental community that values us so highly. How are we doing on the policies? Well, we still do have the 20-acre exempt policy for a very small minority of the small forest landowners. Rick led the charge for 2 or 3 different times in the legislature to make one small change, to change the word parcels to harvest. That would have solved all of our regulatory problems, and it would have saved the state millions of dollars in FRIP liabilities. And the final one, which I've been working on, is this almost forever smaller buffers for our smaller, lower impact harvests. That was part of the deal from our viewpoint. So been working 4 years on that in the making, and still ongoing. I think Bob Brink is in the audience. He was on the very first Small Landowner Advisory Committee. He might say, it's really 20 years in the making and still ongoing. few statistics. About 40% of the forest practice applications that DNR receives each year are from small forest landowners. Only about 40% of those have water within the harvest units, and only about 4% of the small landowner FPAs include an alternate plan. For a variety of reasons, I could spend all day talking about why that doesn't work for small landowners. And more importantly, only about 27% of the harvested acres annually are from small forest landowners. And of course, we've been working over 4 years, as I said, with the adaptive management program on a science-based template that has smaller and simpler buffers for our stream widths. They're based on stream widths. Tammy Makita has dug through all of the prior small forest landowner alternate plans, over 200 of them, to see if there is any relationship to our current proposal. Different folks see different things, but in general, and with an extra effort, small forest landowner plans approved were comparable to the RMZ widths in our current proposals. The Westergreens in the audience have alternate plans, are nearly identical to our proposal. So these prescriptions should be doable more easily for the rest of us. If we're going to be successful in the adaptive management program, getting our alternate harvest restrictions for our smaller, relatively low impact harvests, what are the potential impacts at the landscape level and over time? This is a huge question or concern by those who are working with us in the adaptive management program. Luke Rogers will address this question in a more sophisticated way, but using some of DNR's statistics, Elaine has painted a clearer picture of the potential impacts on alternate harvest restrictions for small landowners only, assuming they're ultimately approved by the Forest Practice Board. So this first graph just shows like the biggest chart is all the FPAs that DNR processes every year, roughly 4,000. The second bar down is the number that are small landowners, typically about 1,700 FPAs, and the bottom bar shows the limited number, 600 annually on average, that are, involve fish streams. Again, more importantly, to give us a clearer look, framing its impact, is more useful to look at the relative acres affected. There are about 23 million acres total forest in Washington State. That's the top bar. 11 million of those are non-federal. Therefore, they're subject to the forest and fish rules. The third bar down, at the current harvest rates, about 9 million acres are harvested over a 50-year period of time. And next to the bottom bar shows small forest landowners, which about over a 50-year period of time harvest about 2.5 million acres. So when you pull out of the small forest landowner acres the harvested portion that is upland, that leaves that very skinny bar down at the bottom, about 197,000 acres that are actually adjacent to fish streams over a 50-year period of time. That sounds like a lot, but again, that's over 50 years, so that's only really about 4,000 acres per year out of 23 million acres statewide, which seems to us to be a very low risk and consistent with the 4 legs of forest and fish. That doesn't mean that there isn't any potential impact on those harvests, but it does put more light on the proposal, from our proposal, from a landscape risk perspective. In addition to very few acres at some level of risk in our proposal, in addition to the very few acres at some level of risk, the scientists are telling us that, so far anyway, that our proposal buffers have relatively low or no impact on RMZ functions compared to the overall full buffers in forest and fish. So how would you characterize that risk? Everybody that's going to be taking an opinion on that is going to have to characterize the overall risk and balance that with the small differences to smalls and buffers. So Stephen Bernath at DNR taught me a really big word a number of years ago called de minimis that seems to fit the potential landscape level, the impact of more aggressive management on our small acres. But that term doesn't seem to set well with the regulatory community. So maybe it's, I don't know, like a dimple on a pimple on a flea's behind. That's the way my dad would characterize it. But clearly, there must be at least some small added risk. But how does that low risk tolerance relate to all the legs of forest and fish? Regardless, we're not here to litigate a specific proposal. We are blessed to have such a fine list of panelists that will hopefully help us answer some of our core questions that relate to the long-term viability of keeping more forest land forested for generations to come. In the end, it would seem that the greater good is finding ways to keep more forest land forested for at least the 7 generations that the tribes strive for. So these are the general questions that we're hoping to touch today. The questions that surely will help slow the rates of conversions from small forest landowners. How and why did we get forests and fish? How do family forest owners fit into the future needs and aspirations of other agencies and stakeholders? Do family forest owners and rural Washingtonians matter? Will future generations feel the love from city folks? You sound skeptical. Will forest land owners have a greater social license where it really is cool to be a tree farmer in the eyes of others? So with that, please welcome the next panel members to come up to the stage, please. Come up to the stage, please. Come up to the stage.